Okay, hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for spending time with us today for Go Big with GitHub Copilot, from access to impact. Over the next hour, we're going to talk about how to move from simply having Copilot licenses to seeing measurable improvements in productivity, quality, and secure adoption across your engineering organization. This isn't just a feature tour. It's really about answering a bigger question. How do we turn GitHub Copilot into an engineering advantage? By the end of this session, you should have a much clearer picture on the kinds of workflows to target, what to measure, and the kinds of practices that help Copilot stick in day-to-day work, not just a pilot or a proof of concept. Over to you, Adam.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eric. So let's get started with some quick introductions. So my name is Adam Smeets. I'm a principal consultant at Atmosera. I'm joined by Eric Peterson, who you've met already. And together we've been working hands-on with teams that are deploying GitHub Copilot in real engineering environments. Our backgrounds, and I'll have Eric introduce himself in a minute too, our backgrounds span education, software development, prior CTO roles, and product leadership, and really a shared focus on AI adoption, behavior change, and systems thinking. We bring experience and certifications across also advanced security, Copilot administration, actions, and foundations. So the lens that we're going to be bringing you today is both technical and operational. So how do you make Copilot work for you, for your people, and also within your existing ways of working instead of just bolting it as a one-off tool. But Eric, I want to make sure you have a chance to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, so I'm a self-proclaimed nerd. I like to work with GitHub Copilot to ease my day-to-day development needs. I work as a solution architect, so my days as a frontline developer are behind me, but I find Copilot's very useful in creating utility scripts that help me scope engagements, things like that.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you so much. So let's set the frame with just a really, really simple question, and that's kind of why now, right? Why GitHub Copilot? Why AI? Why now? So if you're looking at what engineering teams are being asked to do, there are some consistent themes. One is this pressure to ship faster without adding additional headcount. Another is this need to reduce cognitive load so developers can stay connected, focused, engaged, which ties to this satisfaction and retention. And what we'll see in the next part here is that research on GitHub shows some really powerful signals for us. It's that developers using Copilot completed tasks 55% faster, and many said that they stayed in the flow, which is a really important element of their work, and that they stayed and preserved their mental effort, especially on repetitive work, right? So in that same study, 73% of developers reported, or 87% reported that they preserved this mental effort in this work, which is really beneficial for folks, especially if you're in solving a problem or solving an issue. So the question is not really is Copilot helpful, right? I think we've all arrived at this place that AI can be helpful in our work, but we see it with velocity and cognitive load as being part of that. So the real question becomes instead, how do we combine those benefits with the right practices so that they both not only get the speed, but also the quality at the same time, rather than trading off one for the other? And so building on that, this conversation inside most organizations we find has shifted, and they're moving away from can AI tools like Copilot help individual developers, and has moved towards how do we scale this safely and consistently across teams. And what we see is that this pilot proves possibilities, and that's what folks are often doing. Eric, we can go on to a couple of these in this section. What we see in the pilots is that they prove possibility, right, as part of it, but it's an operating model that really needs to deliver impact. And pilots will often tell you, yes, this can work, right? It's plausible, but the operating model approaches it from how does this work reliably for us, right, across our teams and our environment with our people. And importantly, the work is mostly people and process, not just tooling. Operationalizing Copilot has to be thinking about intentionality and thinking about workflows, habits, what guardrails you have in place, and measurements. And it's not just about flipping a switch and putting in place a system. Right now, a relatively small portion of employees report that their companies have communicated a clear AI plan, right? And we find that having a plan in place is one that employees are asking for, and that they like that structure. And so what we hear is that they feel more prepared and more comfortable when they're actually having a plan in place. So this clarity and communication really matter when trying to move from experimentation to everyday use. And so the last piece that we'll talk about in kind of the setting the frame is kind of the model that we've approached this at, is that successful teams do something really, really specific, and they treat it like a capability, an engineering capability, not just a feature flag. So instead of trying to apply Copilot everywhere at once, they'll think about these high value workflows. First, things like documentation or refactoring, testing, code review. These are areas where Copilot can really generate immediate value and help developers see these tangible benefits in their day-to-day work. That being said, they also share and celebrate quick wins and opportunities so that success is visible across the organization. So they are able to anchor their enablement in real work, not just in one-time training sessions. They get the chance to practice using Copilot while doing their actual tasks, which is really the habit that will drive change, right? We want to make sure that we're not just doing tasks to do them, but also how that enables that in that space. From a measurement side, this doesn't stop at license counts, right? We see folks looking at adoption, thinking about time saved, thinking about throughput, and also about cycle time, the signals that ultimately connect Copilot usage back to productivity and quality. And that's how you move ultimately from curiosity to confidence, right? And that's what we'll take a peek at in a moment here. And ultimately, advantage can be measured. And so the pattern really for us becomes start small, win fast, make it stick, and show impact. And that's kind of the patterns that we see. So let's walk through this visual, because it really does capture, I think, the journey organizations will go through that we see when they adopt Copilot. So if we start first in this curiosity space, this is where we see most teams beginning, that they're experimenting on their own, playing with prompts, trying out tasks and ad hoc tasks, and they'll get to, wow, that was fast kind of moments. And they're exciting, but at this stage, they're not predictable or repeatable patterns, and they're kind of personal discoveries. Then we see as teams start taking Copilot more seriously, they move into this space of confidence, which is shown in the bottom right. This is where individuals start validating Copilot's output more systematically. They'll use tests, reviews, human judgment. And then this is where leaders begin asking questions about quality, governance, and support. And then lastly, we reach this point about capability, and this is really the turning point. It's where all the shared workflows and habits, not just one-off training, but teams enabling each other's work, learning from patterns in regular practices, is really where we start seeing stabilization, and they normalize using GitHub Copilot as part of their daily engineering workflows. And so the first kind of connector that we see between this is between curiosity and confidence, which is where people are validating and de-risking what Copilot can do. So when you hear that, where you hear folks talking about risk and validation of work, they're in that transition process from curiosity to confidence. And then from capability to curiosity, from confidence to capability, we see this where it's about reinforcing and normalizing good habits. And a lot of folks are sitting in this stage currently where they're thinking about their patterns and behaviors. And then lastly, from capability to curiosity, this is once these workflows are established, they can ritualize and codify what are the things that work for their organization. And so when you combine all of this together, these three different phases and also the errors, this is where we see measured impact, right? This is the place where it's not a tool, it's a strategic capability, and it's really about progression, right? And thinking about how folks move through the organization as part of that. And so, Eric, I think on this next one, it'd be great if you could talk to us about why tools don't create change, right? So we've talked about all these things about change in organizations, but I'm sure some folks have this at their homes.
Here's the reality. Many teams run into after turning on GitHub Copilot. Tools alone don't change. So some of you in this webinar might have a machine like this in a room in your home or office. What often happens after Copilot is enabled is an uneven adoption. You have a mix of power users who jump in enthusiastically and others who barely touch it. This creates inconsistency and sometimes even skepticism about overall value. You'll get trust gaps, questions about quality, governance, and whether organizations can rely on AI-generated code. People may see some wins, but if those wins stay anecdotal and don't get tied back to measurable outcomes, momentum stalls. Underneath all that is often a missing behavioral system. There's no set of rituals, code, and reinforcement that say, this is how we use Copilot, this is how we validate its output, and this is how we incorporate it into our normal way of working. Without that system, the pilot phase doesn't naturally convert into sustained value. To unlock Copilot's real value, it helps to zoom out and look at the entire software development lifecycle, from planning through build and review, all the way to testing, shipping, and operations. Copilot isn't just an IDE helper. It can be a workflow accelerator across the lifecycle. For example, during planning, it can help you turn requirements into clear acceptance criteria and well-scoped work items, summarize scope risks and dependencies into a concise, delivery-ready plan. That plan can be worked on via agent or via humans at this point. In the build phase, you can use Copilot to understand unfamiliar code, refactor safely, and accelerate implementations using the ask, plan, and implement patterns. In review, it can help summarize pull request changes and even draft actionable feedback and risk and quality concerns. And during test and ship, it can generate tests and strengthen the quality of signals you look at before merging or releasing changes. Finally, in operations, Copilot can help draft troubleshooting questions and convert what you discover into follow-up work items for the next sprint. This creates a tight loop between operating the system and improving it. So when you think about Copilot, think about it as something that can be woven throughout the plan, build, review, test, ship, and operate stages, not just something you use while typing code. Next, it's helpful to look at how other organizations are approaching this. The pattern you'll see is that they're treating AI as a workflow accelerator embedded into their life cycle, not a standalone tool. For example, AT&T uses an internal generative AI assistant, Ask AT&T, embedded into developer workflows to speed coding and automate vulnerability remediation by generating passages with human oversight. JP Morgan Payments uses Copilot assisted coding and AI augmented pull request reviews, including an internal PR buddy tool, bringing AI both into the inner loop where the developers work and outer loop, PR review. American Express has standardized generative AI delivery with an internal orchestration framework called TechChain, which bakes in deployment, security, and enterprise controls. And at Goldman Sachs, an in-house large language models are used to interpret and document legacy code, helping developers understand code written by former employees and speed up onboarding and maintenance. So how do we actually help teams go big with Copilot? The focus is on hands-on practical learning tied to real business use cases. The goal is to build confidence first, then mastery, then sustainable adoption, all in a way that aligns leadership, culture, and technical readiness. This often starts with a manager workshop, typically a 2-day experience that focuses on technical readiness and leadership practices that support adoption. Leaders learn what good looks like and how to create space and support for their teams. Then we move on to a team enablement sprint, a 2-week sprint where teams apply AI directly to real engineering work supported by a collaborative engineer. Office hours are an important part of this. They give the people a chance to bring AI-specific questions and challenges and help get context. And beyond that, there's an ongoing reinforcement phase where rituals, measurement, coaching, and follow-through make adoption a part of your normal work, not a temporary initiative. Now you're going to look at a workflow end-to-end. Before we do, a quick check on your setup. For the hands-on components, you'll want an IDE installed. That could be Visual Code or another IDE such as IntelliJ, PyCharm, Eclipse, Xcode, Visual Studio, and so on. You'll want to make sure you can open and access a repository, whether that's via clone and pull or simply downloading a zip. You'll also want to be signed in with your GitHub account and have the GitHub Copilot extension installed and up to date. If you're not fully set up right now, that's okay. You can still follow along conceptually and then apply the workflow later when your environment is ready. The key is to see how this all fits together in a real development workflow.
So Eric, thank you so much. Just before we transition into the demo, just to call out for folks, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. And we also are dropping a link in for you to access the files that we're working with as part of this demo experience that we'll do. So I'll share my screen here, Eric, and we'll transition into here. So just to kind of set the stage here for the demo here. We're going to walk through a realistic scenario, turning a requirement into working code, and you'll see how it analyzes risk. And as part of this, we're going to inherit a bad scenario from another person, and Eric's going to be our manager in this space. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Great. There we go. Perfect. Let's see. There we go. Sorry, folks, I got bumped from my session, and I'm not quite sure why I got bumped, but here I am. So let me go ahead and try that share one more time for you. Here we go. Perfect. All right. So on my screen, I'll go ahead and pull up my VS Code here. And again, you can use GitHub Copilot in in other IDEs, but I'll just use it for this purpose as part of the demo. And I'll do a zoom in here just to make sure you all can see full screen as possible. And so I was a manager that has ultimately inherited some pretty gnarly code here, right? And as part of that, I have not really code necessarily, but logs, right? So I have a set of logs in here. And as part of that, I have some bad information stored in my logs that we passed along to potentially some of my middleware, right, including access keys, some tokens, and other pieces. Now, for the purposes of this demo, obviously, this has all been AI generated, so it does not reflect any real information or actual people, but we wanted to use it as this case. So Eric, I have an app log, which basically keeps track of all the API transfers, and a temp log for login and access. This was core access, employee two-factor authentication, some investigation logs, and then even payment flows that we're moving along. We see there's some pretty interesting data that's in here. As part of this environment, we also created with AI kind of a log analysis dashboard, which it'll take a look at some of the log files that are included here and scan for sensitive data. So right now we have 1,100 lines that were scanned, and there's 79 types of sensitive data that were found, mostly email, but there's also API keys, SSNs, tokens, bearers, and credit cards. As a reminder, none of this is real information. It's just meant to be visual for us in terms of information to work with as part of that. So Eric, how might we use AI to support us in this, knowing that if you are the manager inheriting this and you needed to ship these logs to another service, what would you normally need to do without AI in order to do this?
Normally, you'd have to take the sensitive data out of these logs as the first step.
Great. So I'm going to go into chat and use one of the newer features called Plan, right? And I'm going to say, I'm going to add all my logs as part of this, right? And things that we know about AI, right, is that we want to make sure and throw a persona first in here. So if you were to hire someone to do this work, Eric, what role might they have?
They might be a security engineer with privacy knowledge.
You are a security engineer with a strong focus on privacy and data security. Okay. I need to use these logs in a separate platform and need to would we remove, or what would we do with the data that might be considered
Probably redact
private?
it.
Great. And need to redact the information for privacy. How can we do this? So we have, just as a quick level set, we have the option to use agents. We could use ask, we could use plan. Part of my reason for using plan here is I'm asking Copilot to come up with a strategy of how we might approach this rather than just going into agent mode as part of this. And so how can we do this? And I want to have an action plan to fix this in the future with automation. right? So we're going to throw that prompt to AI as part of this, right? And so we're automatically are going to get back now based on that. It's going to start creating this comprehensive plan. So you'll notice that it found in these multiple log files that they're sensitive data. It's the current file the user has open, which of course, it's reading that first to understand. It's already taken a peek at all these other ones and sees that there's a full scope of secure types that are being presented in here. So it's saying it found email addresses, phone numbers, so on and so forth. That's all we found in our data checker previously. Now, for context, in these data files, we did not give clues to AI that these types of data types were inside, but it's actually determining that based on us giving the persona up front. So you'll notice as this is filling in the information, one of the pieces that we didn't do was say, what type of context or what type of format do we want our response placed in? But let's see what it comes back with as part of that. So it's updating its session memory and documenting the assessment and the action plan. So we'll see what it comes back with here. So we've created a markdown file with AI that basically is the plan. So let's take a look here. Now, in my instructions files locally, I always like a TLDR or too long didn't read. So you'll see here I have your logs contain this. We need immediate pattern-based recognition, followed by real-time redaction pipeline to access the future logs, which is great. That's what we're looking for. So it's come up with for us a multi-phase plan. First, immediately redact what you have, right? So we're not storing these as part of those resources currently. Then putting in some automated prevention in our infrastructure as part of the pipelines, and then also establishing some governance, right, about maybe how we prevent this in the future for not only this, but other systems, right? So in here, we could review all of these as well as the future considerations, right, that are listed here. Or we can actually do what's called a quick action, which is to do start implementation, right? So what I'm going to do is I'll open it over in the editor so you can see this plan, right? So we're going to go create this file because I always like to keep the history of what the work is that we're doing as part of the plan. So we'll go ahead and take a peek over here on the left. Take just a moment for it to load for us. There we go. And we'll keep that file here. Okay, so here we have now our markdown file that is the plan of action that we're going to work on together. So now I'll say, let's go ahead and implement this change. Perfect. Let's go ahead and implement this plan. So what will happen is Copilot will take this plan that was listed here, and it should create a series of tasks for us that will actually be done, and we can see that status as it goes along. So now we have 7 to-dos that have been created as a result of this plan. So the first is it's going to create this redaction script, right? So right now it actually has decided it's going to do phase 1. So it's not going to do all of the things that we have in the series. But first, it's going to go ahead and create this redaction script, which is nice because if we encounter other files that have similar patterns, we can actually reuse this again from the system, because likely for us to make such a transition in that period of time, we may have other files that have been created since then. So right now, Copilot is taking a peek across all these log files and is going to create, and I found, Eric, I don't know about you, but I found Python seems to be the go-to for a lot of Copilot's code actions that get created as part of it. Has that been your experience as well?
It has been.
Okay, yeah. So we'll go ahead where it just created our redact logs Python file. We'll go ahead and keep that. And you'll notice that it's doing pattern matching, right, as part of this. So we have this full pattern match document that's been, or a code file that's been created. I'm going to go ahead and let Python run on my Mac. We'll go ahead and have that run. And you'll notice now we have these redacted log files that are now created. And so what we can do is, before I have AI check to see how well it did, I'm going to rethrow these back into the analysis dashboard. So before we had a total of 79 sensitive data items found. Let's go ahead and see what we get now with our redacted versions of these. So this is redacted, all redacted. There we go. And let's scan. So now we have 13 sensitive data types left that we have now reduced that from just from one interaction that we've had with AI. So let's go ahead and rerun this validation just to check if there's anything else that we see here. So it's rechecking against the redacted logs, and it noticed that it didn't get the validation pattern correct, right? So we know from our file that we have bearer, API key, and database URL are still present within this. So we're going to go ahead and fix that. The script's going to go ahead and modify itself one more time that that's the case. And I just want to see if bearer is considered. It is not considered as part of this. So we'll go ahead and give it some new information. So one of the new features that's available within GitHub Copilot is you can actually steer a conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and say database URL, bearer, and API key. Those are ones that we need to add. So I'm going to go ahead and say, go ahead and redact. We also need to remove or redact these. So we'll go ahead and put this in here too. Right, allow, and I'll steer the message. So steering is not stopping a chat from happening. It's interjecting in the stream of AI thought and adding in more context so that it doesn't stop its train as it's moving along in the process. So you'll notice that it did inject that as part of the process. And so we have the historical stop and send, which has been the version that's been previously available. But now you can also add to queue or steer. Add to queue means you have more ideas that you want AI to consider and can keep going through that, and it'll churn through each of those in order. And then steering is providing additional context that can be helpful for a user as they're going, or for AI as it's going through your materials. So let's just double check, because now it's going back through and finding some of these other patterns that it's found. And we'll just double check that these are the case. So you'll notice it's made some modifications for passwords. It's added new validation patterns that we asked for based on database URL and bearer tokens. So let's just double check that our logs now are going to be cleaned up. We'll run this one more time as part of it. So we'll redact our logs, just ran that. Okay, so before we recheck again, let's go ahead and re-upload those files one more time and see what we're down to now. So now we're down to only 7, so we're less than 0.6%. And again, we can keep going back and forth essentially with this process to get to the point where it has full coverage across that redaction that we're looking for as part of it. So I'm going to go back in here and just say, as an example, we still have database URLs, passwords, and bearers in our logs, right? So I'm going to steer this again as part of it. And so while it's wanting to create something thinking that it's been fully successful, we still have some of these redacted logs. Now, it would be helpful as a user to share back some of these examples, right, of where it appears within those lines just for AI's purposes. So I will actually take a screenshot of this, because we're actually not showing the confidential data in this web page. But what I can do is provide, here's the examples, right? I can actually share with it where I found those pieces, and I'll steer that message one more time. So because it has vision capabilities, right, it's able to look at that image and determine where were those lines, what were the things that were found. And you're noticing right now, it says, you're right, I did find other patterns that weren't caught. Let me add these redaction patterns directly to the code. So what you're seeing is this is meant to be conversational in terms of how to approach this, where it's able to get a good 80–85% of that log verification and validation, and then ultimately redaction. But as we run and we create these tools to actually do that verification, there's some other areas that it hadn't caught. So it's added some new patterns in here. So let's double check that it's clean by rerunning this one more time. We're down to 7 as part of this. And we'll go ahead and hit scan. We're down to 4. We only have password left. So what we'll do is we'll run one more just to say that we found password, and we'll just get those 4 knocked out, and then we'll continue on just kind of at the why, go through this exercise. One more set of password. There we go. So the importance of doing this, right? This is a one-time that we're doing right now with a single file. But ultimately, what we're informing is a process that can be repeated, right? So that we can reuse this on other files that come from similar platforms, number one. Number two, we can inform governance and process. So that's going to be our next step, is what type of governance do we need to provide back to these systems? And that's where folks will think about GitHub Copilot as solely a coding assistant, but it's way more than that, especially in the VS Code space in terms of the work that we can provide. So let me go ahead and double check, and we'll show some other examples here as part of that. So Eric, if let's say we got this code file down to 0 at this point, right? So we have our code file down to 0. We have our redacted logs as part of this, right? We might use, like, put this into our ETL process, right, as an example for like extract and transform, right? But we're probably not getting at the root issue here, which is at the source system, right, where this data is coming out of before it transports to other places. Is there any other things that we might do, right, separate from this, after creating this, that you might do as a result? Any suggestions?
Well, we might add this to a GitHub Advanced Security workflow to make sure that any of these patterns are also caught, to make sure we're preventing future log files from being checked into source code that have these sensitive items in them.
Awesome. Yes. So this was helpful. So there's research to support being nice to your Copilot. So I'm going to be nice to my Copilot as part of this. I'll say this was great. I would like to add a GitHub action and workflow that detects any data like these from being checked in or being part of a PR. Can you build something like that? Now, this is part of we had phases of our project rollout for those that are watching or recall back to us having that as part of our process. But I'm doing this intentionally because I want to skip to that specific set of our phases for instructions. And so it looks like it's still working on some of these pieces, but I'm going to interject on it and just basically say now stop and send. And so we'll go ahead and do this as part of it. Stop and send. Yes. Yes, I do. There we go. So now what we're going to do is ask Copilot to create exactly what Eric was looking for, right? A workflow that has a security scan associated to it to make sure that someone doesn't unintentionally commit any of the pieces like what we saw in these log files from being part of our repo, right? So obviously, a .github folder is required along with having a workflow subfolder as part of that. So it's going through and creating that structure for us. And it's going to create this workflow file that will run on any pushes or PRs to scan for this sensitive information. And so let's take a peek what it's creating for us. So you'll notice it's got based on our pushes and pulls on our main master and develop branches. And in here, it's checking out our code and it's running our actual scan sensitive data pie that it is creating as part of that will run and returning a set of JSON files that will contain those security results based on that. And so if it does find data or violations based on that, it will say that these violations were found with patterns. It won't actually give the output data, but the patterns were found in here and it will block that commit based on the environment or that PR from taking place, which is a great blocker ultimately for this to take place. Now, we know, Eric, as part of this, right, if you put out this, it's not 100%, right? Things will slide through as part of this, right? And so there's also other things we might want to do internally that might be around governance, right? So if you wanted to share something internally, would you do an email? Would you do, what kind of material would you want to create to distribute based on that?
Based on the scan results, I would probably just want a summarized report like you had in your original document.
Right. So when we have these, right? So we have actions in place and workflows, and we have these. Sometimes folks will get a little too dependent on the scanner and not actually check things that they themselves are putting in. That can happen on occasion. And so sometimes what you can also use, right, and I'm going to have it stop its workflow for a moment as part of this, and I'll commit these back to the repo here. I will call out, we do have this in the web page as well, but this is meant for demo purposes. Please don't use this as official security guidance or as part of an actual assessment that you would do, but just wanted to make sure and call that one more time. But one thing that I find myself doing too is, thanks for creating this. I need to send an email to team members letting them know about this new action, also how to safely secure their data in a commit or PR, right? So you can actually leverage Copilot to also draft some of these communications based on the work that it has completed, right? So at this point, we're not solely using it to create code. We're not using it solely to be a cybersecurity engineer. We're not using it solely to be an auditor, which we've done all of those things up to this point. Now we are also asking it to be a communications expert to share its insights about how we could articulate this plan, essentially of how to secure individual data or data from logs in an environment. So right now it's going in and it's created this team security notification markdown file that says, here's the subject, hi team, we implemented a new security measure. Here's what's new, here's why it matters, here's what to expect. And here's the best practices for safe development. Now, this is pretty robust. And I think most people, if it was on my team from a previous group, they wouldn't read past probably the 5th line, right, of what was here because it's too much information, right? So another thing you can do is, this is helpful, but I need a TLDR email and then a place to point people in the repo. So what we can do is actually break this communication in 2 parts then at that point and do an email version and then its own essentially addition to the README doc as part of it. So what we've done is essentially take this from plan, right, which is we have this problem where we have 5 log files that contain thousands of pieces of information that we maybe don't want to go upstream into our middleware platforms and reporting platforms, and asked Copilot to be a partner to create a plan, which it did, and it gave us basically a 4-phase deployment approach for this. And we took the first phase to essentially create the solution. With Eric's managerial guidance, we created an action that is essentially going to be stored as part of a workflow in GitHub that will monitor those things as they come in for PRs and block those from coming into the system. And then lastly, we have the communication loop, which is going to let folks know what exactly is going into the system so they're not surprised when their commits or PRs become blocked because they contain certain information. They'll know how to work through those as part of the place. And so we took that communication and now are breaking this out into ultimately an email and a page that will be stored in a markdown file inside of our GitHub repo. So the purpose of this demo, again, was to show you kind of the framework of what can be done from an idea that we had 7 minutes ago to now a fully fledged approach to dealing with unsanitized logs, and also an approach, some governance as well as communication strategies that we can use with our teams. So we've created now, here's the team security email that's far more brief, right? And what to do if your PR gets blocked. And then we have a security guide that talks about how to prevent sensitive data from being committed or stored in the environment. So we have a full kind of solution that has come out of this space. So
we had a
again,
question.
If folks, go ahead, Eric, please.
We had a question come in. What model were you using for this demo?
Yeah, great question. So right now I'm using Claude 4 as part of this. I oscillate between 4 and 4.5. 4.6 has been a little bit chatty for me as part of it. So I've stuck with 4 for quicker, more direct code responses. 4.5 when I have more time and want to get into more conversational pieces. But great question. Thank you.
And then another question, does GitHub Copilot work with repositories in Azure DevOps, or does it require GitHub.com? And I can jump in there. You can use—
Go ahead, Eric, please.
Yeah, you can use GitHub Copilot with Azure DevOps repositories when you clone them down locally. There are some advantages to having your code hosted on GitHub.com, namely when you're using the coding agent functionality. That feature is limited to repositories that are hosted on GitHub. We can, if you fill out the survey at the end of the call, we can also give you a feature comparison if you're interested. Okay.
Awesome. Eric, would you mind sharing back your screen for the next part of our session?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks for that demo, Adam. Now that you have a pilot or early rollout in place, the next question is, what should we measure? Let's start with the first mile, which is all about activation and competence. One key metric is first mile completion. Are your licensed users becoming weekly active users, and are they getting through the initial friction of onboarding? Another usage is telemetry that actually matters, not just assigned users, but last activity dates and early indicators like suggestion acceptance rates and lines accepted. These tell you whether people are really using Copilot and finding it helpful before you see shifts in downstream engineering metrics. You can also look at enablement pull-through, participation in training and office hours. Office hours in particularly often becomes a backbone signal of momentum because they show people are engaged, curious, and are running into real-world questions. And finally, track a confidence trends, not just use lists, a simple pulse score about whether developers feel able to use Copilot on real work. All of this rolls up to an understanding on whether you're building an operating model, not just adoption in the abstract, but a way of working that incorporates Copilot intentionally.
And Eric, sorry to cut in for just one quick second. This portion of the webinar, these 3 areas for measuring and measurement in areas, is one that I don't know about you, Eric, but it's one that I get the most questions about from customers and from groups is what are the things we should focus on, right? And so as you see and hear us talk about these 3 different areas, one thing to keep in mind is these are also deeply cultural within your organization. So we're giving you the trends and patterns that we're hearing, but your organization will identify what's most important to you in the areas that are most critical in that space. So I just wanted to make sure and call that out. But sorry, Eric.
Yeah, very well said. Once that first mile is underway, we move into workflow integration and behavior systems. Here, we're looking at whether Copilot is starting to show up in the rituals of the team. One concept here is the Ritual Adoption Index, looking for evidence that Copilot is appearing in stand-ups, retrospectives, and communities of practice, and that is reflected in things like pull request templates or shared prompt rituals. This is where you see Copilot shifting from a personal experiment to a shared team practice. You also want to watch reinforcement signals, prompt sharing, demo sessions, best practice submissions, and manager check-ins. Are your leaders reinforcing your use of GitHub Copilot? Another helpful view is readiness and resistance heat map, classifying teams by stage, from curious to experimenting to consistent to optimizing, and understanding why some teams might be stuck. And then there's the verification burden. Are teams building a sustainable trust but verify habit with tests and review, or are they accumulating a backlog of AI-generated code that no one has time to validate? That's a crucial indicator of whether your Copilot usage is healthy and sustainable. Impact. The third category measures and focuses on outcomes and risks, which is where you start to build your case to scale. One input is time saved and task completion, captured through a lightweight survey, a survey engine concept. You ask people to report roughly how much time they're saving and what kind of tasks they're completing faster, then connect that to your intended downstream metrics. You then look at engineering throughput and flow, things like throughput and cycle time as lagging indicators. Another dimension is quality stability, trends and defects, build success, other quality signals, and direction of test coverage. The aim is to get to speed while maintaining or improving quality. Finally, you consider governance adherence. What percentage of users are following your Copilot usage guidelines and validation checklists? As adoption scales, governance needs to scale with it, not become a blocker, but also not get left behind. Put together, this gives you a cascade: task completion and time savings, system outcomes like throughput and quality, organizational confidence that it's safe and valuable to scale. Anything to add here, Adam?
No, that was great. Thanks, Eric.
Over to you.
So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about change and how change happens in organizations and with people. And we'll be brief in this portion, but this is a really key differentiator in working with Atmosera, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Eric will share some insights with you in that space. But we know that for adoption to stick, it impacts both the individual and the organization. So here, there's a set of pillars that Atmosera firmly stands with, which is the ADKAR model. which is these areas that are based on first awareness. It's the individual's awareness of organizational priorities, their strategic direction, and it begins with understanding the collective purpose, the purpose of why we're doing something in the first place. And it's the individual's understanding, not the manager pushing the information to the employee as awareness, but that they understand that piece. Then we have desire, which is the motivation to contribute to team and organizational success, right? So it has to be that person's commitment to wanting to make something better or use Copilot as part of their work. Then there's knowledge, which is the understanding the proven approaches, best practices, the learning and the desire to want to learn and be part of that space. Then we find comes ability as part of this, which is the ability to apply the skills and learning and knowledge with guidance and support. And it does require some type of structured practice. And we find that that's often the hardest for organizations to provide employees, is the space to experiment and to continuously grow and develop, right? And that's the one that we know is critical as well. And then lastly is reinforcement. And this is where the reinforcement that is going to sustain the change with accountability. So it has to be reinforced with these consistent practices and recognition. So when you're thinking about Copilot adoption, it's not just about rolling out a tool. You have to support people across each of these areas. And it's starting first with awareness. If you don't have awareness, you can't get to desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And you have to start first with making sure that the awareness is there. So post thinking about, and at the same, actually parallel thinking to ADKARs, we think about what we call 4 foundations. And so there are 4 foundational areas that we see that are key pillars for organizational change, and they're culture, talent, structure, and governance. So culture is about the alignment, the leadership support, and creating a collaborative learning environment where experimentation ultimately with tools like Copilot is encouraged and supported as part of the work. Talent covers the skills development, the knowledge transfer, structured training, and expert guidance, and all the ways that you can help people build capability. Structure, think of that as the practical side, the clear workflows, defined roles, creating protected time. That's the second time you've heard that, and organizational level support for learning when using AI in real work. And governance ensures that these quality standards, proven practices, and escalation pathways and validation is in place. And these pillars together help support AI adoption at an organizational level, not just in the ways that the organization operates, and it becomes part of the fiber rather than just being kind of a temporary initiative and something else that we're trying as part of that work. So when we think about scaling, right, and thinking about this next step, there's a helpful pattern to think about in terms of in terms of hubs and spokes or repeatable waves. And if you're thinking about what your journey will look like as part of this, think about standing up the hub, right, which is a lightweight center of excellence, which meaning that you have clear roles, you define what success looks like, and set up guardrails up front as part of that. Then activating spokes, which is launching champions and mentors to drive peer momentum, and equipping managers to protect time and reinforce their habits. And then from there, you roll out in waves, scaling adoption through structured waves with defined criteria and entry points. This allows you to ultimately embed Copilot into the workflow and pushing AI usage where it's expected becomes part of the normal work. And they're standardizing your organizational repos and instructions so that team patterns become part of the environment and less churn. And then lastly, running reinforcement and measurement as part of the system. And office hours and communities are part of your experience, and you have operational cadence for understanding metrics and your decisions. And this is how you ultimately get both sustained adoption and visibility in terms of impact. And Eric will chat with you in a moment here about how we kind of approach this through 3 different lenses for engagement paths, but this is essentially our operating model that we use in these five stages, and then also using the change models that we've talked about a few moments ago. But Eric, can you chat with us a little bit about these engagement paths?
Yeah, so the first path is readiness and use case discovery. It's best for teams early in their journey, not quite sure where to start. The focus is to identify high-value workflows and adoption risk before scaling. So at the end of this engagement, you walk away with a prioritized workflow shortlist, a view of risk, and baseline success measures, a clear picture of what good looks like for your Copilot in your context. The next step adds engineering enablement sprints and workshops on top of that discovery work. So again, you start with the readiness and use case discovery, the same journey for organizations unsure where to begin. And you focus on those high priority workflows, adoption risks, and the set of baseline measures. And then you add engineering enablement sprints and workshops. The focus there is a hands-on application of Copilot to real development scenarios, producing role-based patterns, reusable examples, and office hour support. So it's not a one-time training, but a practice embedded in real work. The combination gives you both the strategic view of where to use Copilot and the practical enablement to help teams start using it effectively. The third path builds on those two and adds a pilot accelerating program for organizations ready to scale further. So you still have the readiness and use case assessment for teams early in their journey. You still have the engineering sprints and the workshops. On top of that, you add the pilot acceleration program, which is best for scaling from a successful pilot to multiple teams. Focus there is a structured rollout with measurable productivity and quality outcomes, resulting in a scaled propagation plan, governance rhythm, adoption dashboard, and a final impact report that gives you both the story of impact and the mechanisms to continue scaling forward with confidence. That brings us to our question and answer section. So as we said, there's the questions and answers that you can type here. It's been a pleasure meeting you today, and we'll stick around answering any questions as they come in. While we wait for our first question, Adam, what's the thing that you've seen engineering managers light up the most about when they start to see what Copilot can do?
You know, I think the biggest one has it changes, which is why I paused in my response to you, because as new features become available, the opinions have changed. It used to be that Copilot instructions were the thing that got managers excited because they could put their expectations for documentation, for testing, and all the other decisions as part of that document. And they still like that, but the agents are really becoming the big place where managers are now lighting up as part of this, because they're scaling some of their abilities that, for we'll call it an informed intern type role, that they can't hire for, but they can actually align an agent to provide that support. And so we're starting to see a lot of folks beginning to use those as part of their workflow, and sharing them across teams. So their reach as a manager of setting their expectations now becomes an actionable agent as part of their work. So I would say that's the place that I'm seeing a lot of folks light up for that. And the other, sorry, two answers. The second part is that I think for a while managers have struggled with not having enough resources to support their teams, and AI is providing, in the form of GitHub Copilot, a real way to expand support in another way, where folks can address the higher priority work, or the areas that get them excited about coding, and some of the things that were more of the tedious doldrum work that they weren't as excited about, they're shelving to AI to provide that support for. So I think that's the place that that has been the key driver. But great question.
Yeah.
Eric, one came in from Rita about elaborating on using GitHub versus DevOps in terms of advantages.
Yeah, when you're leveraging on the GitHub platform, you have the full feature set of GitHub Copilot available to you. So things like the automated pull request review. You have the context of your models not fed through your IDE, so you can use larger context windows. And you have the full suite of GitHub features as soon as they're released. When you're using an IDE, you're related to a subset of the features of GitHub Copilot based on whatever IDE you're using. So Visual Studio Code has the flagship experience, and those features are rolled out to other IDEs as development time allows. We have another question. Do agents remember the model that is used in Copilot chat? How do outputs based in different models differ in such cases?
So great question, Eric. Do you want to take it or do you want me to take it? Because I can do it if you like. Awesome. So you actually, it's not remember in the sense of the agent. So you can actually define and say the agent must use or can use these models. So in the configuration of the agent, you'll actually place model and you can actually say any of the following or only this one. So if a user calls that agent and they're not using that model, it will snap it to use that model as part of its work. How do outputs do? So outputs based on different models are based on how they've been trained in the foundational configuration, right? So there are going to be folks, and I'm going to share just from my own experience, right? Not that this is GitHub Copilot specific product language, but so a lot of folks who use Java are really keen to Claude 4 or 4.5 is a really common pattern, whereas some folks prefer GPT-5 for ASP.NET and some other language platforms. And part of it is based on how they've been trained, right? What's the model base? So a lot of Claude's model has been aligned specifically for a coding platform or coding languages. GPT-5 is conversational and has also been trained, but it has a much more verbose language platform for .NET and other places. So part of this is, I hate to give you the answer of trial and error, but some of this is people build an affinity to specific models based on the work that they're doing, and that certain models are not geared towards the type of work. So what I hear from folks, and what I mean by that is, what I hear from folks is, well, there's 0 times models that are in the environment, but I don't ever use those. I only use the 1 times for premium requests in GitHub Copilot. And I will tell managers a lot that that's a mistake, that oftentimes they're doing open-ended questions or exploratory questions first and don't know where they're going. So they're in ask mode, even though they're using agent. And so I'll encourage folks to use 0 times as a place to explore ideas and think about things before they actually ask for code work to be done if they're keen to use a one-time multiplier. And so I just encourage you to always think about using your 0 times models as part of the approach if you're doing investigation, thinking about, or idea generation as part of that, and reserving your 1 times for more complex coding tasks that are more aligned with the type of work that you're doing. So it's a very broad question, but it's one that is based on personal preference, code delivery, and also we talked a lot about the confidence, right? Confidence in the results, where folks find the most confidence in the reports that they're getting. So gave you a little more and then some, but I wanted to make sure that I covered that as best I could. Eric, did I miss anything that you'd like to add to that question as well?
Just that the different 0x and 1x multipliers affect the cost of using Copilot after you've run out of your premium requests. So your advice is for the cost conscious among us while we're prompting very well.
Yeah, that's another reason we hear folks talking about that they ran out of premium requests or they're getting billed. So that's one way to approach that too. I'm going to drop in the chat just because we talked about something but didn't demo it. This is the link to creating a custom agent for those that wanted to do a follow along to complete that. I just wanted to share that out so folks have it. There's one that you can do it from a repo in GitHub, and then later on in the document it talks about VS Code, JetBrains, and then also Eclipse and Xcode as part of the options. So just making sure folks have that as a resource.
Yeah. So after this call, there'll be a brief survey if you want to hear about any of the enablement options that we discussed today. So we value our survey. So please take time to fill that out as this call ends. And I think we've gotten to all the questions. So thanks for joining us today.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks, Eric, as well.
Thank you.
Bye.